Welcome back to CrimePOd Castle's Twisted Love series, episode 29. Get ready for a deep dive into a case that proves sometimes reality is stranger and sadly much darker than fiction. We're heading to Indore, India, back in 2020 for a story that gripped the nation, the Indore Love Triangle Case. You've sent over some fascinating material on this, and I have to say, it's a real roller coaster.
It is. And what strikes me, looking at your sources, is how this seemingly ordinary relationship took such a dark turn. We've got ambition, jealousy, and a whole lot of unanswered questions.
Okay, so let's set the stage. Our main players are Priya Sharma, a driven marketing professional, her boyfriend Sameer Khan, a dedicated software engineer. And then there's Aakash Verma, a friend from Priya's college days who, as we'll see, had some, well, complicated feelings for her.
And right from the start, you can sense trouble brewing. One of the articles you shared mentions Sameer's unease with Priya's friendship with Aakash. It makes you wonder, was this just typical relationship insecurity or was there something more to it?
Right. I mean, jealousy is a pretty universal emotion, but something about Sameer's reaction feels heightened based on what his friends said. He was described as quiet, maybe even a little shy. So you have to wonder if seeing Priya with a more outgoing Aakash, a successful entrepreneur, triggered deeper insecurities.
That's a great point. If you look at similar cases, the perpetrator often projects their own vulnerabilities onto the victim. It's almost like they convince themselves the victim is responsible for their emotional turmoil.
So let's talk about Aakash. He didn't just sit back and watch this tension unfold. He actively inserted himself into the situation. One source mentions him subtly undermining Sameer, planting seeds of doubt in Priya's mind, and always positioning himself as, well, her confidant. It's textbook manipulation, really.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this case so disturbing. He wasn't passively harboring feelings. He was actively trying to sabotage their relationship. This wasn't just a love triangle. It was a calculated game.
And then on August 12, 2020, everything changes. Sameer is found dead in his apartment, multiple stab wounds. At first glance, it looked like a burglary gone wrong, but as the police dug deeper,
Things took a very dark turn. The evidence began to point towards Aakash, and what initially appeared to be a random act of violence quickly unraveled into a carefully planned crime of passion.
it's like something out of a true crime documentary. So the police started piecing together a timeline. They spoke to friends and neighbors who confirmed that Priya and Sameer had been arguing a lot in the weeks leading up to the murder. And guess who was often seen visiting Priya late at night?
Aakash. That piece of information, combined with the forensic evidence found at the crime scene, painted a very damning picture. The murder weapon, a knife, was traced back to Aakash's kitchen. And to seal the deal, DNA evidence placed Aakash in Sameer's apartment on the night of the murder.
Talk about a smoking gun.
Yeah.
I mean, faced with all of that, Aakash cracked under interrogation and confessed to the crime. He admitted to confronting Sameer, accusing him of mistreating Priya and even threatening to take her away. But this is where things get really interesting, don't they? Was this purely a crime fueled by jealousy, or is there something deeper at play?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Did Aakash genuinely believe he was some kind of knight in shining armor, rescuing Priya from a bad relationship? Or was this about control and possessiveness? I'm leaning towards the latter, especially when you consider the level of planning involved.
Right, because if you look at the psychological profile that was built during the investigation, Aakash fits the pattern of someone who needs to be in control, who can't handle rejection.
Exactly. And that brings us to the trial, which, as you've seen in the court transcripts, was a media frenzy. The prosecution, of course, portrayed Aakash as this manipulative and obsessive individual, driven to murder by his unrequited love for Priya. They had his confession, the forensic evidence, the witness testimonies, everything.
It was a slam dunk case.
Yeah.
Right? But even so, the defense tried to present a different narrative. They argued that it wasn't premeditated, but rather a spontaneous act of passion committed in the heat of the moment.
They claimed Aakash was overwhelmed with emotional distress during that confrontation, which led to this tragic but unplanned act of violence. They were basically pushing for a manslaughter charge instead of murder, hoping for a more lenient sentence.
It's a classic defense strategy. But in this case, I'm not so sure it holds water. I mean, one of the sources you provided, a psychological evaluation of Aakash, actually contradicts this idea of him being simply overcome by emotion.
That's a great point. The evaluation suggests a long-standing pattern of obsessive behavior and a difficulty in accepting boundaries. The defense's argument feels a little flimsy in light of that, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But regardless, the trial was captivating. The nation was glued to their screens, fascinated by this story of love, betrayal, and the dark side of human emotion.
And in the end, the court saw through the defense's argument. In early 2021, Aakash was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge's statement really emphasizes the brutality of the crime and the impact it had on Sameer's family and friends.
It's a tragic end to a story that could have been so different. But before we jump into the verdict and its implications, I think it's worth taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture. What can we learn from this case? What are the red flags that we should be aware of in our own relationships?
That's a great question and a perfect segue into the next part of our deep dive. Stay with us, folks.
Welcome back. Before we went off, we were talking about Akash's conviction and the trial. It really throws into sharp relief the dangers of unchecked obsession.
It does. And while the legal side is fascinating, I think what's even more important for our listener is unpacking the psychology behind this whole situation. Why do you think someone like Akash goes to such extremes? Well, one thing that jumps out from your research is the role of societal expectations. I know the listener's familiar with India, and like many cultures, there's a huge emphasis on romantic love, almost to the point where it defines a person's worth.
So it's not just about finding love, but it's about this idea of winning someone's heart,
Right.
almost like a competition.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly dangerous because when love becomes this all-consuming ideal, it can blind you to reality. You miss the red flags, the unhealthy patterns, even outright manipulation because you're so fixated on this idea of the one.
And in Akash's case, it seems like he had this whole narrative built up in his head. He was the hero, Sameer was the villain, and Priya was the damsel in distress. He completely disregarded their actual relationship and imposed his own fantasy onto it.
It's a classic case of what psychologists call cognitive distortion. He twisted reality to fit his own desires, and tragically, the consequences were fatal.
One thing that really struck me, looking at the materials you sent, is how everyone seemed to be tiptoeing around the issue. Like, people saw the warning signs, the jealousy, the possessiveness, but they didn't really address them head on.
That's a great observation. And it speaks to a larger societal issue. We often romanticize jealousy as a sign of passion, ignoring how destructive it can be. We need to shift that narrative and recognize that healthy relationships are built on trust and open communication, not control.
It's like we're afraid to talk about these darker emotions. We sweep them under the rug instead of confronting them.
And that silence can be deadly, as this case tragically demonstrates. We need to encourage open and honest conversations about these issues. We need to equip individuals, especially young people, with the tools to recognize red flags, communicate effectively, and seek help when needed.
I completely agree. It's not just about romantic relationships either. This applies to friendships, family dynamics, even professional settings.
Right. It's about setting healthy boundaries and recognizing when those boundaries are being violated. And it's about knowing that it's okay to ask for help. There are resources available, organizations dedicated to supporting victims of abuse and promoting healthy relationships.
Speaking of support, one thing that stood out to me in the trial transcripts was how Sameer's friends described him. They said he was a good guy, quiet, maybe a little shy, but always willing to help others. It makes you wonder if he felt comfortable expressing his concerns about Aakash.
That's a really important point. We often associate these kinds of situations with women as the victims, but it's crucial to remember that men can be victims of manipulation and abuse, too.
And societal expectations play a role there as well. Men are often taught to suppress their emotions, to be strong and stoic. That can make it incredibly difficult for them to open up about their vulnerabilities, even to their closest friends.
Absolutely. We need to challenge those harmful stereotypes and create spaces where men feel comfortable expressing their feelings without fear of judgment.
So, while this case has reached its legal conclusion, it's clear that the ripple effects continue to be felt. It's a story that compels us to examine our own relationships, our societal norms, and our individual responsibility to foster healthy dynamics.
I think you hit the nail on the head. This isn't just about a single tragic incident. It's about a much larger conversation that we need to be having.
And speaking of conversations, we're going to take a quick break to gather our thoughts. We'll be right back to delve deeper into those larger implications and what we can all learn from the Indore Love Triangle case. We've spent this episode unpacking the Indore Love Triangle case, a story that reminds us that jealousy, left unchecked, can have devastating consequences. But beyond the specifics of this case, I think there are universal lessons to be learned here, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. You know, going through the material you provided, what really struck me was how many red flags were present right from the beginning. It's like a textbook example of how things can escalate when those warning signs are ignored.
That's so true. And often those signs are subtle at first, making them easy to dismiss. We might tell ourselves, oh, it's just a phase or they're just a little intense. But the reality is these behaviors rarely resolve themselves without some kind of intervention.
Exactly. And you brought up a good point earlier about how everyone seemed to be tiptoeing around the issue. I think there's a real fear of getting involved in other people's relationships, even when we see things that concern us.
It's like that old saying, mind your own business. But in a situation like this where someone's well-being is at stake, I think we have a responsibility to speak up, even if it's uncomfortable.
I couldn't agree more. Silence can be complicit, especially when it comes to abusive or manipulative behavior.
So what can our listener, and really anyone listening, do to change that? I mean, how do we create a culture where people feel empowered to speak up and support each other?
I think it starts with education. We need to teach people from a young age about healthy relationship dynamics. What are the signs of a healthy relationship? What are the red flags? How do you communicate effectively? How do you set boundaries?
Right, because these are skills that aren't necessarily taught in school, but they're essential for navigating life, relationships, and really any kind of social interaction.
Absolutely. And it's not just about teaching these skills, but also about creating a culture where it's okay to talk about them. We need to normalize conversations about mental health, about difficult emotions, about the challenges of
I
relationships.
think one of the most important takeaways from this case is that you're never alone. There are resources available, organizations dedicated to supporting people who are experiencing relationship challenges, whether it's emotional abuse, physical abuse, or anything in between.
Exactly. And it's not a sign of weakness to seek help, it's a sign of strength. It takes courage to admit that you need support, and there are people out there who are trained and ready to provide that support.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a few key points to remember. First, trust your gut. If something feels off in a relationship, it probably is. Second, don't be afraid to speak up. Whether it's for yourself or for someone you care about, your voice matters. And finally, know that help is available. You are not alone in this.
That's a great summary. And I would just add one more thing. Let's remember Sameer. Let's honor his memory by learning from this tragedy and working to create a world where love is a source of joy, not pain. A world where relationships are built on respect, trust, and genuine connection.
Beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Indore Love Triangle case. We hope this conversation has provided valuable insights and encouraged you to reflect on your own relationships and the importance of fostering healthy dynamics. Remember, you deserve to be in relationships where you feel loved, respected, and valued for who you truly are. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to the podcast and our YouTube channel for more deep dives into fascinating and thought-provoking topics. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay connected.